Welcome to Don't Chuck It Up, the podcast where we help students and families navigate the wild journey of the college search and applying to colleges without breaking a sweat. I'm your host, Chuck, and today we have a guest. I'm excited to welcome to the podcast today Annie Tulkin. Annie is joining us from accessiblecollege.com. And welcome to the show, Annie.
Hey, thanks, Chuck. I'm happy to be here.
So excited to have you. So why don't you take a moment and give us a little introduction and help my listeners understand who you are and what you do?
Sure. So at Accessible College, I provide college transition support for students with physical disabilities. So that might be a wheelchair user, a mobility device user, someone who maybe sometimes needs a wheelchair or mobility device. Also students with sensory impairments, so hearing impairments, visual impairments, deaf students, blind students. And students who have chronic health conditions. And that can be a wide variety of things. So that might be a student who has a migraine disorder, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, POTS, Crohn's disease, diabetes, epilepsy, basically anything that might impact their ability to engage in college. And the reason I got into this work is because I used to be the associate director of the Disability Support Office at Georgetown University. So I was there for about 6 years, supporting undergraduate, graduate, and medical school students with physical disabilities and health conditions. And one of the things that sort of emerged in that work there was that students were coming in really underprepared for what college accommodations could look like. And they hadn't really thought about independent living, continuity of care, managing medication, how they would sort of navigate spaces and what they needed. And so I started Accessible College to address those pieces, because when I looked around, I saw that there was a lot of support for students with learning disabilities, ADD, and autism, but no real tailored support for students with physical disabilities and health conditions. And so I started Accessible College to sort of bridge that gap. And what I found, too, is that students don't typically have one thing going on, right? So many of the students I support have co-occurring conditions, so learning disabilities and physical disabilities, or chronic health conditions and mental health conditions. None of us fit neatly into a box. And so it's really important that we're sort of looking at the whole sort of scope of who that student is, and also, intersectional identities as well. And I should say, too, that not only am I a person who supports students with disabilities, but I'm also a professional who identifies as having disabilities, too. So, and we can dig more into that as we go along in this conversation. So I bring that with me as sort of my personal experience to how I work with students and guide them thinking about their own needs and what they might be considering in the college search process.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love your passion and interest for this topic as someone myself who has significant disabilities and have to manage my own accommodations, and someone who has worked in disability services myself. I completely understand the need for your type of knowledge and coaching that students and parents need to consider as they navigate this path from high school to college. I think a lot of parents are so used to the supports that are available to them in their K-12 experience, and many of them have really hands-on engagement where they have an IEP meeting or a 504 meeting, and they're meeting with students and parents regularly, and that can look very different in a college setting. And I don't think students and parents think about that. And I think every student has the opportunity to go to college, regardless as to what type of challenge they have, what type of accessibility issues they have. Every student has a right to go to college. It's trying to find the colleges that fit them so that they are able to really succeed, thrive, and really accomplish what they're wanting to do in the future. So talk to me about what are things that high school students and parents are approaching you with. Where are they struggling? Where are they really coming up against the brick wall?
Sure. I mean, and just sort of, providing some base knowledge for the listeners out there, right? So high school accommodations fall under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That's the law that provides special education supports and services for students with disabilities, kindergarten through 12th grade. And high school is also governed by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That's where you get a 504 plan from. And that is an anti-discrimination law. So it says that students with disabilities cannot be discriminated against on the basis of a disability. So if your student has an IEP, an Individualized Education Program that comes from IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and IEPs have accommodations, and they might also have services like occupational therapy or speech therapy or tutoring services or supports built into them.
Mm-hmm.
And when a student goes to college, they don't have an IEP or a 504 plan. Every college has their own documentation guidelines and provides quote unquote reasonable accommodations under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, what is reasonable sort of varies based on the program that the student is going into, the space, the physical layout of the college campus, and some of the pieces that the professors might have in place for their particular courses, the fundamental goals of the class. And so students have to be the ones who are driving the process of requesting accommodations in college. They have to be connecting with the disability support offices, and every college has a disability support office. They all have different names. Could be accessibility services or student disability services or accessibility services. And so it's really important that if a student has any type of disability and they receive accommodations in high school, or even if they don't receive accommodations in high school, but they have a condition that might impact them when they're living more independently away from their guardians and parents, that they research what the Disability Support Office offers and start to think about what their specific needs are going to be. How do they get their medication now? How do they structure their time now? Who takes care of their calendar? Who manages things for them when they're at home? Or do they manage things independently? And how would they do that? How would they continue that work when they're away at school? If there are personal care needs, that's a huge one, especially for students who have significant physical disabilities. Colleges do not provide one-on-one aides or paraeducators. So if a student has personal care needs, they have to hire, manage, and fund their own personal care attendants in the college setting. And that's often a surprise to many students and families.
Yep.
And so that's another sort of piece of this puzzle. But students and families are typically coming to me trying to figure out what questions should they be asking in advance of applying to a school or as they're researching schools, to try and understand what accommodations they may or may not receive in the college setting, and how to vet those schools, right? So how to get a sense of what the accommodations might be. Because for many students with health conditions, it's not as straightforward as someone who has a more typical condition like a learning disability, where they may just need extra time on tests and a note taker. So, 21% of college students report having a disability, and most college students who are receiving accommodations are getting them for learning disabilities and mental health conditions. So students with chronic health conditions and physical disabilities are a much smaller part of the overall population of students who are requesting accommodations. And so oftentimes folks in the disability support offices may not have as much experience supporting these students. And so it's really helpful when a student comes in knowing what accommodations they may be looking for, knowing what questions that they have for that staff. That can really help the students start to tease out, what's important and what they may or may not get from that university. And especially when you're spending tons of money on a college education, right? You want to make sure that you're getting a service that's going to be good for you, right? And so that's, a lot of the work that I do is coaching students and families on navigating this process of asking the right questions, figuring out the best fit, and then implementing strategies for success, like medication management strategies, supporting the students in finding care that they might need in a nearby community or whatever that student needs.
Yeah, I agree with really everything that you said. One thing that I noticed when I worked in disability services is that some parents were surprised, well, and students were surprised by the amount of accommodations that some colleges can provide. They didn't have these things in high school, or they were just not thought about because, the school was built less than 100 years ago and was much more accessible, and students didn't think about it. On my caseload when I was in disability services, I had a large chunk of ADD and LD, but then I also had sensory and physical disabilities. So I had those that had visual impairments, hearing impairments, and mobility challenges, which was, as you said, a much smaller percentage of the student body, but many of them hadn't thought through, as you were talking before, the independent nature of college. Even the thing as easy as, oh, how do you get your medications? Well, if you're staying close to home, you might be able to still use your same pharmacy that you've used throughout your life. But if you're moving farther than, 25 miles away from home, it might be really challenging, especially if you're moving out of state and people don't think about that. Um, what are some of the things that you are hearing from either students or parents that you wish you could let families know that they could understand at this point in time in the process? Many of our listeners have either just applied to college or are starting the process of looking at colleges and will apply next fall.
One thing that I find is really important is having upfront conversations with disability support offices prior to committing, absolutely,
Hmm.
and,
Yeah.
and
Oh, for sure.
prior to applying if possible. Right? Like, so, you want to have a conversation to understand, like, who are those people in that office? How do they approach their work? What is their mission and the values? Um, I often say that the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is the floor and not the ceiling.
Yep.
And colleges can choose to provide more or to modify things in a certain way for students. And there are 4,500-ish colleges across the United States, and you've seen one disability support office, you've seen one disability support office. They vary in shape and size and mission and values. And
Yep.
so it's really important that students sort of know going in, what sorts of things they can expect. Um, and for such a large, it's always sort of surprising to me that such a large population of students, I mentioned that 21% number, which makes
Hmm.
students with disabilities the largest marginalized group on any given college campus, that such a large population of students does not get a lot of specific information in the admissions process going in. I am constantly sort of surprised by that. I think part of it is because there's still a lot of stigma related to disability.
Hmm. Yep.
And if families and students are not demanding the information and asking the questions as they're going in, no one's going to be responsive to provide that information. So we need to be asking these questions. And I feel like the more that students know and are aware that such a high number of other students have disabilities, then it like makes it more okay to talk about, right? Like we have to
Yeah.
destigmatize the process and bring it into the light. Because I do think that really will help. And also I think like for, if there happen to be admissions professionals listening in on this conversation too, it's like providing the information that you can in the admissions process on websites as you're engaging with prospective students is really, really helpful for students to see. I think one of the questions that students ask me all the time is like, what's the culture of disability on a campus, right?
Hmm.
And without much visibility, it's hard to assess whether or not students with disabilities will be accepted on a specific campus, and so or how they will engage in that campus. So, hot tip for everybody, like students, I say this to all of my students: find the student newspaper of that school and start searching disability, accessibility, health condition, whatever key search terms you think might help yield information, because students on campuses are absolutely talking about it. And so it can be really helpful to sort of investigate that and find more information and see what students are talking about. TikTok and Instagram are other great spaces for this
Oh
stuff.
yeah.
Um,
I highly encourage students to use social media. I want to go back to something you said earlier where, students and families should be reaching out to disability or accessibility services in the process. And I equate this really to, a student who's an athlete and wants to play a sport in college, they're going to absolutely reach out to the coaches before they decide to go to that college. A student who wants to study music or art or theater is definitely going to do a deeper dive into those areas as that type of student. But for some reason, students with disabilities don't often think about, oh, what about this? So you almost need to be recruited in a way as a student with a disability to find the disability accessibility office that's going to fit you. Like, do you like the staff? They might have a great disability services facility, but maybe the staff and you don't get along, or maybe they don't have enough staff to accommodate all of the students. So families, you can, when you're going to go visit colleges, you may ask admissions to see if you could connect with disability or accessibility services, or you may have to message them directly, give them a call, send them an email ahead of time. Please don't call them the day before you're arriving, because that's not going to work. But as you're planning your visits to college, add, can we meet with disability or accessibility services? Or if it's something that is dietary, can you meet with dining services? Or if it's something that will affect your living style, maybe you want to meet with someone in residence life. These are all things that should be done well ahead of, hey, I need to decide where I'm going tomorrow. Like, make this as part of your search process.
Chuck, I could not agree more. And I think one of the things that really is striking to a lot of families as they're like navigating this process is that, the accommodations in college are so much broader than just academics, right? So there might be housing accommodations, there could be dining accommodations, transportation accommodations, programmatic accommodations, recreation
Mhm.
accommodations. So it's a lot bigger than it may be when a student is in high school. And sometimes it's hard to even conceive of what those things could be because there's generally no menu for students and
Right.
families. There's no like, choose one here. So students really have to be attuned to what do I need, and then linking their condition, their
Mhm.
condition that they have, the functional limitations they experience, so the things that they experience as a result of that condition, to the request for the type of accommodation that they need. So every college has a housing accommodation process. They probably all have a dining or dietary accommodation process. And
Yep.
generally, all of these processes are on, you can find them online, typically through the Disability Support Office website, but not always. Sometimes you have to dig a little bit deeper. They make you search
Mhm.
for it. But, housing accommodations are a hot topic. I run a Facebook group as well called College Success, Physical Disabilities, Chronic Health, and Mental Health. And maybe we can put a little link to it in the show notes, Chuck. But that's something that comes up almost every week, if not every day, where someone has a housing related question. And so that's usually the first deadline. Once a student commits to a school, housing is usually the first thing that
Yep.
comes up. And housing accommodation requests are typically separate from general housing,
Yeah.
requests for the students. And so students need to be ready to go the minute they commit to that school and sign that dotted line. They have to be ready to send their documentation, have that conversation with the disability office, prepare the form. There are some schools where the housing accommodation request process is due on May 1st alongside the student committing, right? So
Yep.
um, that is a quick turnaround.
Yeah. And
And
that's why I
things
said,
vary.
and that's why I said the process needs to start earlier. And also, especially if your physical challenge really requires a housing accommodation, finding your allies within the residence life office who are going to help advocate for you, because maybe you need to be in a building that is in a different location on campus that may typically not house first year students. So that might need to be a conversation. Another one that I worked with a lot when I was in disability services was students who had Crohn's and needed to have access to restroom facilities at a much easier basis. So I don't think parents realize that if a college is really able to help a student, they might be able to move the class space or the living space based off of what your accommodation needs are. But these things do take time. If we had to move a class on the campus, there was a huge process that had to happen and it had to get approved by the faculty and blah, 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 blah. And what happened often was I literally would be working in disability services and students would come into our office on the first day of class, never having registered with us, didn't even know who they were, and said, "Hey, I need accommodations. I just started classes today." And I was just like, okay, I mean, we can help you, but this is not something that I can just wave my magic wand and fix right now. So please plan ahead. Also, make sure your documentation is something that sometimes is legible and understandable. There was some old documentation that I remember that was like handwritten. I was like, can you please make sure that it is accessible, or it had been photocopied so many times that it was barely legible. So make sure that you have documentation. Every college has different requirements about what their documentation is, so that may take some time to put together. But this is why students and parents need to treat this almost as if you're being recruited for a sport or a fine and performing arts. This is going to take some extra time to cross the T's and dot the I's.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, covered a lot. I want to pause here and kind of learn about what was your educational journey. One of the questions that I ask all of my students and parents that I work with is, where did you go to high school? What was your high school experience like? And then what was your pathway after high school?
Yeah, and it's a great question. So I'll start a little bit earlier than high school. So I grew up on the north side of Chicago, and now my Chicago accent's going to come out. Even though I've been living in the DC area. I'm in Silver Spring, Maryland for, I don't know, almost 15 years or plus now. Um, so I went to private Catholic school, kindergarten through undergrad, actually. But I was diagnosed with a learning disability in about fifth grade. Both of my parents are were guidance counselors. We now call them school counselors. Back then, we called them guidance
Yep.
counselors. I just want to be careful in case a school counselor is listening and says, she said guidance counselor. So my parents, recognized that I was having trouble in math and science in particular, and it turns out that I had some trouble with processing, and I always struggled with math, and that was really hard for me to navigate that and sort of parse out. Like I felt like I wasn't smart enough, like I wasn't good enough, right? But I did well in other things, English and
Mm.
theater and sports and stuff like that. And I went to a Catholic all-girls high school in Wilmette, Illinois, called Regina Dominican High School. If there's any Panthers out there, I'm saying hello to you now. So I got through high school. I made it through those math classes. I struggled through my Spanish class,
Mhm.
as Sister Bernadette would attest to. Um, and I went on to DePaul University in Chicago.
Mhm.
And if I'm now, knowing what I know now, I probably was not a great candidate to go straight to college. Um, I was probably more a candidate to go to AmeriCorps service, or do some volunteer service for a year, take a gap year to figure out who I was and what I wanted. But I did not know that was an option back then. And so I started at DePaul, and I actually lived at home my first quarter, um, and stayed with my parents because I was like, well, we're spending a lot of money on this education. Like, I don't even know if this is
Yep.
what I'd like to do. Um, but I decided to study secondary education, and I made a lot of friends at DePaul, and I moved on to campus my second quarter, and I loved it. And I had work study, and I made a lot of friends. I got through DePaul in 4 years, luckily, because my dad worked at a community college. And so during the summers, I would take courses at Wright Junior College in Chicago, and those credits would transfer over, which was delightful. I'm a big fan of community colleges. Thanks to my dad and that experience. And so I finished up my undergrad in secondary ed, and I realized during my student teaching, I was offered a job at a Chicago public high school, and I looked around and I said, do I want to do this for the rest of my life? Is this the trajectory that I have? And I decided that I needed something else. So I joined the Peace Corps. I applied for Peace Corps, and back then you didn't apply for a specific country. You applied for a region of the world. So I applied for Peace Corps in Mongolia. And that's where I went for 2 years to Mongolia, where I taught English to Mongolian English teachers who had formerly been Russian teachers, and then were told one day that they were English teachers. So I lived on the eastern steppe in Mongolia on the border of China and Russia, on an old Soviet sort of military base, which is as glamorous as it sounds. And if you think it's cold in the Midwest, Chuck, you have no idea how cold it can get.
I can't even imagine. I cannot, and I'm from even farther north where it's even colder, but I can't imagine what Eastern Mongolia winters are like. So,
Yeah. So minus 40 is where Fahrenheit and Celsius meet up, and it is routinely that cold, well below zero. So I did Peace Corps, and I loved it, and I learned a lot and about myself. And most Peace Corps volunteers say, you learn more about yourself than the people do about from you or whatever. And I agree with that. I learned a lot about what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to go into international work and international education. So after Peace Corps, I was accepted to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I got a master's in special education. But during that time, I decided, I want to do more international work. So I applied for a Fulbright, went back to Mongolia on a Fulbright as part of my thesis for University of Wisconsin. And I studied Mongolian teachers' perceptions of disability in the classroom. So kind of a niche thing, but I thought, I'll do international disability and education stuff. And and I love being back in Mongolia and doing that research, and having a Fulbright was amazing, and I really loved that experience. So I joke with people that I spent most of my 20s trying to not have a real job. I was mostly successful at that.
Yep.
I had some stints, babysitting when I came home from my Fulbright and working at a Montessori preschool, until I got a quote unquote real job here in Silver Spring, Maryland, at the Association of University Centers on Disabilities. And I managed grants and worked on a lot of projects there until I decided that I missed working with students and was hired at Georgetown University as the Associate Director of the Disability Support Office there, which is called the Academic Resource Center. So and this was about the time, sort of my late 20s too, where I started to develop some other chronic health conditions, which is quite a common occurrence, as it turns out, that sometimes with age, you recognize that there are other things that are going on as well.
Yeah.
And so in addition to the learning disability, which ended up not really holding me back from anything in life, I also have a couple of chronic health conditions too, which impact my mobility. And I had accommodations in the workplace, and I also make accommodations for myself now because I'm working from home. So that's my long trajectory to this work.
I don't think students and parents think about how we get to where we are. I had a very similar pathway. I went to college in secondary education, well, actually K-12. I was going to be a Spanish-speaking music teacher, which is what my degrees are in. I taught for one semester, and I said, I don't do 7:15 in the morning, and I'm not a K-12. I loved my kindergartners, but there's things that even kindergartners will drive you nuts with. I was offered a position in admissions back at my alma mater, took it for a year, and then navigated my route through graduate school, working at other colleges, discovering the world of higher ed, becoming passionate about admissions and helping families navigate this process, and really feeling frustrated when students were opting not to go to college because they felt too overwhelmed and too confused by the process. And that broke me. I was like,
Yeah.
I need to help students and families because I can navigate this. I understand how this works, and I totally understand why it's confusing and a pile of work. But I thought I could at least help some students, and now I do it for a living, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah, it is really interesting, those paths that we take, and like the things that lend information to those choices, right? So like
Mhm.
after I left Georgetown, I worked for as a consultant for Department of Labor, doing ADA compliance for Job Corps, which is a national vocational training program for low-income youth. And there are Job Corps centers across the United States. So one thing that I think it's really important for students and families to know is that the ADA does not only apply to higher education, it also applies to the workplace too. So if a student needs a workplace accommodation, right, the ADA is the law that would also
Mhm, mhm.
support accommodations for students with disabilities or people with disabilities in the workforce. And that I think is something too, that's another space where I feel like people just don't know what they don't know. And so, there's a lot of things that could be helpful to people in a workplace setting that could be very reasonable accommodations. Like for me, it's like standing desks all over the place. So, um,
Well,
I think
that
that's important.
that got me thinking. So when I was working in graduate school, I know that I needed some accommodations and some things, but I didn't have the money for it. And at that point in time, they referred me to the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, are those types of resources still available for students and families who may need some type of an accommodation? Maybe it's a special technology, maybe they are, in some type of a mobility device and could use a new mobility device because they've used the same one for the last 10 years. Uh, what are some of the financial resources that are available to students and families?
Yeah. So, vocational rehabilitation is absolutely a resource for students with disabilities. There's a couple things to sort of know about that. First, it has different names in every state. so, so,
Course,
you can
government
find.
offices should not be easy to figure out, so
Yeah. Yeah. And it's because there's a federal program and then the states get funds individually. So, there's just it might be vocational rehabilitation services. It could be division of vocational rehabilitation. So the way you would find it is to put in the name of your state and then put in vocational rehabilitation into Google.
got
And
it.
typically that will take you to the right place. Sometimes it's housed in like the aging division of aging and health
Mm.
services. So it can be hard to figure it out. But if your student is in a public high school, most public high schools have a direct line and connection with their state vocational rehabilitation program. There's a program called pre-ETS, pre-employment training services. Um, and public high schools are supposed to be sort of identifying students who might automatically be tracked into the rehabilitation system. So you might want to start by asking your school counselor or your transition counselor, if you have an IEP, if there is a connection between the high school and vocational rehabilitation services that already exists, because that can be an easier on
Yep.
ramp. Oftentimes, school counselors don't think of students who have physical disabilities or health conditions as candidates for voc rehab.
Yep.
Typically, they think of students with intellectual and developmental disabilities or students who have autism or more significant cognitive impairments. So there's a big gap in actually supporting students with other types of disabilities in the voc rehab programs. but it's absolutely available to them. So that's an important piece of the puzzle. And depending on the state you're in, income may be an issue with obtaining voc rehab services. So there might be some financial stipulations that you have to navigate with voc rehab. I don't want to go too far into the whole of this, Chuck, because there's like a lot to unpack. Many of the students that I work with are actually also eligible for supplemental security income, SSI, because of their disability. They may also, some of the students I work with have Medicaid or Medicaid waivers, or have Medicaid as a secondary insurance, or would be eligible for Medicaid and might be using that for, for new wheelchairs or new devices or things like that. So it's highly nuanced and individualized to each person. But there are resources available. I think that's the message we want to hammer home. And so assistive technology in particular, most states have an assistive technology program. So if a person was interested in finding theirs, you would just put in the name of your state and then assistive technology program. And every state has an assistive tech program. So
I was just really surprised. Now, when I had to use vocational rehabilitation when I was in graduate school, and that's where the income piece actually was very beneficial, because I was a poor grad student, like most of us were poor grad students, and vocational rehabilitation came in and said, "Oh, we can help purchase new hearing aids for you, which are extremely expensive if anyone out there has hearing aids, and we can also help pay for college, because this is a financial burden for you as a person with a disability to be able to go to college." So I was just really surprised, and I was not aware, even as someone who was born and raised with a significant disability, that these services were out there. And I just want to make sure that families are aware that these things are available. And Annie, are these things that you would help students and families navigate, and would you be able to coach them as to where they can be looking for some of these resources?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I spend a lot of time sort of helping students connect the dots, right? Of figuring out like what is out there, what should you know about, what again, like how do you knock on the door and pull the levers so that you're getting the services and supports that you need. To your point about like the cost of college and funding for tuition too, like that is something that voc rehab in many states will actually cover a portion of the cost or the whole cost for students with disabilities to be able to go to college. But if you don't know that that's a resource,
Right.
then again,
Yeah.
like you're missing out. I always joke with students, I'm like, we got to shake the money tree and see what falls, you know?
Yeah.
So
I
I
found that
think,
there's a lot of outside scholarships available for students with disabilities. So,
yeah.
whether it's for hearing impairment, I was applying to the Alexander Graham Bell scholarships that are specifically for people with significant hearing challenges. And even when I was working in a disability services office, we had several generous alumni donors who established a scholarship at the college, and students just had to be a registered student with the Disability Accessibility Office, and they had to write an essay explaining the challenges that their disability were presenting to them and how a scholarship would help them navigate through those challenges. And I remember distinctly one young lady winning that scholarship one year, and it really made the difference between her being able to remain in college and make it affordable versus her having to possibly go part-time or get another job or do something like that. And I don't want students and parents to go, this is insurmountable. I will not be able to go to college, or my child will not be able to go to college because they have some type of disability. I think there's actually, as you said, there's a lot of resources, but parents and students are not aware because all of these resources are scattered across the wind. And it's like, okay, how do we help students and families navigate this and find all of their points of connection, both at the college and outside of the college?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a guide, and I'll send you the link to it for the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation on navigating the transition to college with paralysis. And I have a program with the Reeve Foundation, so students with any type of limb paralysis, which is like a big tent term, can work with me for free through the Reeve Foundation for up to 3 hours on this sort of college planning. And I'll send you the links so that you've got that. And I also I worked with the Perkins School for the Blind and created a college readiness website for blind, visually impaired students and students with co-occurring conditions too. So there's a lot of stuff out there that explains sort of how to navigate these pieces of paying for college, preparing for college, thinking about accommodations too. And I mentioned my Facebook group earlier, but I also have an online course that I created for educators, for parents, for anybody, healthcare providers, anybody who supports students with physical disabilities and health conditions, which is a great starting point for thinking about how are we talking to disability support offices? How are we understanding laws? Thinking about independent living and needs. And folks can find that on my website too. It's accessiblecollege.com.
I was just going to make a plug. I was saying, yeah, if you're wanting more information about Annie Tolkien and all the coaching and resources she provides, or you want to learn about that course that she provides as a wonderful resource to parents and people navigating this, check out her website, accessiblecollege.com. That's also a great way to get in touch with Annie if you'd like to set up a consultation to see if she would be able to help you further through this process. Annie also mentioned to me before we started recording that she works with people like me, independent educational consultants. So if you were working with an independent educational consultant or a high school counselor or some type of college counselor, and they aren't very familiar with how to navigate this world of accessibility and disability services, you can also collaborate with Annie and be able to get that knowledge base so that you are crossing your T's and dotting your I's and feeling very confident about the transition from high school to higher education. As I tell you every time on the podcast, listeners, you can do this. This is possible. It just takes some extra planning to make sure that you cross the T's, dot the I's, so you can navigate the college search and application process with confidence and with ease. Annie, any last tips or advice that you want to make sure that my listeners know before this episode ends?
Yeah, start early.
I agree. I don't think students and families think about this, but I literally have students with significant learning disabilities or other challenges that will start with me as early as 8th grade, because we want to think about course planning. We want to think about summers. We want to think about doing college tours early so students know what to look for, what not to look for, and how to really do this with confidence. Can you launch into this as a second semester junior or an early senior? Sure, but you're going to have to be doing a bit of a sprint to get to that finish line versus a casual and nice, easy, relaxing stroll if you start earlier in your educational career.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Annie, for being on the Don't Chuck It Up podcast. I really appreciate all of the resources, time, and really dedication to this field, because this is an area that is near and dear to my own heart. And I really appreciate you spending some time with me today to talk about how you help students and families through accessiblecollege.com.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck.
Well, folks, that's all the time we have for today, but fear not, we will be back next week with more tips and tricks to help you conquer the college application process like a boss. Until then, remember, don't chuck it up.